Number 1, printed in Part C of House Report 113-215. For what purpose does the gentleman from Montana seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part C of House Report number 113-215, offered by Mr. Daines of Montana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 351, the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Daines, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Montana.
Mr. Chairman, as a fifth-generation Montanan and an avid sportsman, I understand how protecting our beautiful landscapes and unmatched recreational opportunities are important to our way of life in Montana. As much a part of Montana as our enjoyment of the great outdoors is, our timber industry, or at least what used to be one. The timber industry has declined 90% since I was a kid. Since then, the wildfires and beetle kill have worsened. Our loggers play an important role in the front lines of protecting our outdoor heritage, and we must never forget that. I'm very concerned that many of these special places are being destroyed because the Forest Service does not have the tools necessary to manage these lands responsibly. H.R. 1526 gives the Forest Service the tools to protect and enhance our forests and will allow our timber industry to get back to work. It will cut the red tape that has held up responsible forest management and timber production. It includes comprehensive reforms to discourage and limit the flood of frivolous appeals and litigation. It also requires the Forest Service to increase timber harvests on non-wilderness lands now that it will have a much-needed latitude to do its work. This improved management will protect the health of our forests and watersheds, the safety of our communities, jobs in the timber industry, and our cherished access to the outdoors. H.R. 1526 would help create 68,000 jobs and nearly 5,000 jobs in Montana. H.R. 1526 would allow access to marketable timber for our mills in Montana and breathe life back into this dying industry. This bill keeps the federal government's commitment to crucial revenue and protecting it to our forest counties. It extends the Secure Rural Schools program for 1 year as the new timber program stands up. SRS has provided essential stopgap funding for timber counties since 2000, but many of our counties are tired of seeing their funds depend on the whims of Congress. This bill has the support of the National Association of Forest Counties. This bill has the support of the National Education Association because they recognize the economic development and the revenue that will be generated by our bill will strengthen our rural schools in states like Montana. Importantly, this bill helps to protect healthy forest management from habitual lawsuits that are brought by fringe groups. My amendment would strengthen the bill's protections against court-ordered obstruction. Unfortunately, obstructionist tactics too often stop them from going forward. In Region 1 alone, at least 40% of timber sales in fiscal 12 and fiscal 13 have been appealed or litigated. A top U.S. Forest Service official recently acknowledged that the abundance of litigation has played a huge role in blocking responsible timber sales. In March of this year, the Friends of the Wild Swan, Alliance for the Wild Rockies, and others halted a much-needed timber sale called the Colt Summit Project near City Lake in Montana due to a minor technical error by the Forest Service involving the impact of the habitat of a listed species, the Canadian lynx. Like the Colt Summit Project, oftentimes timber sales are stopped in their tracks by court-issued injunctions that are based solely on alleged procedural violations such as mere paperwork errors. My amendment would prohibit these injunctions that are based on non-substantive allegations. Injunctions on timber sales often turn into permanent delays, leaving dying timber to rot and lose value. My amendment would allow these critical projects to move forward while litigation on the merits of the case is pending. In doing so, it will help ensure that responsible timber sales come to fruition. My amendment simply allows projects like the Colt Summit Project to move forward while the merits of the case continue to be examined. I urge my colleagues to urge my support in making our forests healthier, and I yield to the chairman.
I want to tell the gentleman I think this amendment adds a great deal to this legislation, and I will support your amendment, and I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you. Well, I urge my colleagues to join me in support of making our forests healthier and for the adoption of my amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
Like many here tonight, I'm frustrated by the seemingly endless appeals and litigation on efforts to responsibly manage our forests. But not all appeals and litigation are frivolous. We know that some zero-cut groups seeking to end all logging in national forests have been successful in nitpicking the Forest Service to submission in Montana. However, this amendment literally tips the scales of justice. The underlying bill already places extraordinary restrictions on parties, which I mentioned earlier, over which I have concern, on parties seeking to protect public resources. Do we really want to tell people they can't protest a government activity if the federal government violates a procedural requirement? Failing to give notice of a major activity is a procedural requirement. Shouldn't a community be able to appeal an activity that's moving forward if they think it might impact their drinking water and they were never notified about the proposal? Failing to properly advertise for bids is a procedural requirement. Shouldn't a small business be able to stop a project from being awarded to an out-of-state company if the Forest Service failed to follow proper contracting protocol? The underlying bill already has numerous provisions that accelerate the approval of projects and makes litigation much more difficult. We don't need to tip the scales further towards the power of big government and away from the public. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Oregon reserves. The gentleman from Montana.
Mr. Chairman, I respect the comments made from the gentleman from Oregon, but when we look at the state of Montana and see a 90% reduction in forest timber harvest on national forest lands, and when we hear from the Forest Service officials the #1 issue is litigation, it is time that we put in place measures and reforms this amendment addresses those kind of concerns of procedural nature will not stop an entire forest project. This is a very real issue in my home state. I saw it literally firsthand when I was visiting the Pyramid Sawmill in Steely Lake, when we saw, because of literally a small little procedural error on one of 14 counts, that stopped an entire timber harvest. This is getting out in front and saying, let's not let the trial lawyers and the courts control the forests. Let's let the people have control of the forest and restore the jobs that are needed and the revenues back to our schools. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oregon.
I yield myself the balance of the time. You know, we did have a hearing on this and similar issues, and I did find common ground with folks on the other side of the aisle. We had a vigorous debate over fuel reduction 13 years ago, which ultimately resulted in a law called HIFRA, and I participated in writing that law here on the House side, very much a bipartisan law with myself and Mr. Miller on the Democratic side, and Scott McInnes, John Shedegg, and Greg Walden on the other. And we gave this tool to the Forest Service, and they pretty much haven't used it. They've used it in very minor ways. And at the hearing, I asked the Deputy Chief, what about HIFRA? Do we really need to change the laws further or prevent, do these radical things like preventing appeals and litigation? And he said, well, no, we're moving ahead with a major landscape scale collaborative process in the Black Hills. I said, well, that's great, Mr. Deputy. I said, how about all the rest of the Intermountain West? How about Central Oregon and other places where we need these sort of landscape scale projects that can't be nitpicked, acre by acre, but they are developed collaboratively, and we move forward, and we, as I mentioned earlier, we can do them under stewardship contracts, which will attract investors who will utilize the biomass and lower the costs to the Forest Service. There is a way to better do this. We need to push the Forest Service on these issues. If there are minor changes that need to be made in HIFRA, they should let us know. I believe one is that it doesn't allow for them to go into areas of bug kill, and that is something that should be fixed and was fixed in a bipartisan bill in the Senate, which we recommended in part in a Democratic alternative here, which was offered in committee but not allowed on the floor because of scoring issues. So I believe there is a way to move forward here and solve some of these problems, but this is not the proper way. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oregon yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Montana. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
On that,
The amendment, and for what purpose, the gentleman from Oregon?
Recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Montana will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in Part C, House Report 113-215. For what purpose does the gentleman from Montana seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part C of House Report number 113-215, offered by Mr. Daines of Montana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 351, the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Daines, and a member opposed. Each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Montana.
Mr. Chairman, nationwide, more than 73 million acres of Forest Service lands and hundreds of millions of acres of other federal lands are at risk for catastrophic wildfire. As our timber industry has declined by 90% in recent decades, however, our national forest system has lost much of the labor force to sustain our forested ecosystems and to protect our communities. The Restoring Healthy Forests for Healthy Communities Act addresses both challenges, providing the Forest Service with much-needed latitude to reduce the risk of catastrophic fires while revitalizing our country's dying timber industry. I'm offering an amendment to hold the Forest Service accountable for doing the work required in this legislation. My amendment would simply require the Secretary of Agriculture to submit to Congress an annual report. In fact, the amendment specifies this annual report is 1 page in length. Rarely do we see a report here in Washington that is less than about 3 inches thick. This is going to require that it's just a 1-page summary, simple, focused on the results for each Forest Service revenue area. On this report, we would report the annual volume requirements in effect for that fiscal year, the volume of board feet actually harvested, the average cost of preparation of timber sales, the revenues generated from such sales, and the amount of receipts distributed to each beneficiary county. The amendment would also require that the Forest Service place the report on its website. The American people, whose lives are often in the paths of catastrophic wildfire, whose jobs rely on access to timber, and whose school systems and public works rely on revenues generated from federal land within its borders, deserve transparency and accountability in our federal government's land management. And our country needs results. My amendment brings all 3 principles to the Forest Service as the agency implements in H.R. 1526. I urge the adoption of my amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time. I will.
I thank the gentleman for offering this amendment. I think it adds a lot to it, because if we transition to targets in the future, I think something like this would be very beneficial, and so I congratulate the gentleman and I support his amendment.
Gentleman from Montana reserves. Gentleman from Oregon. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, the previous amendment was going to limit public access to information. Now we're going to ask the Forest Service to produce more information, although actually we aren't asking them to produce more information. We're asking them to produce less information than they currently make publicly available. It'd require an annual report to Congress on the results implementing Title I. Amendment require an annual report, volume of timber, cost of preparing timber sales, revenue from the sales, and amounts distributed to counties on 1 page. Well, the Forest Service does prepare these reports on a quarterly basis. It is available online, but no, it's not 1 page. I guess we could put it on 1 page. I'm having trouble reading it at this scale, which is 18 pages. This is the 18-page report for the Beaverhead Deer Lodge Forest. If we look at the report, they offered 3.4 million board feet of timber. The amount of timber delayed, withdrawn from sale, what was successfully bid on, what didn't get any bids. There are also quarterly cut and sold reports show the value of these sales. In the first quarter of 2013, the Beaverhead Deer Lodge sold $312,000 worth of timber, nearly all of it lodgepole pine. If we would limit it to 1 page, we might lose other things like the report on Christmas trees, $6,050 value for sales of Christmas trees, mushrooms, $1,500 in the Bitterroot National Forest. So the Forest Service is, already producing this information. They are posting it online. I know it's kind of de rigueur around here to say, let's get it all down to 1 page. Well, we can put it on 1 page, but you're going to need a microscope to read it, unless you want to leave out a lot of the stuff we're getting. And it's kind of interesting if you really want to know what's going on the forest. If you want to know valid bids, no bids, delayed bids, withdrawn, resold, reoffered, regular sales, canceled, opted other volume, resold, reoffered, previous fiscal year volume, replacement volume. I mean, how are you going to fit all this stuff on one page? So we're just going to tell them, don't bother anymore to produce this data? We don't want it. The public doesn't want it. So under the guise of asking for information, we're actually going to tell the Forest Service to produce less, which, you know, they might be kind of happy with, because they will be less accountable if they produce less information. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Montana is recognized.
I appreciate the gentleman from Oregon's remarks there. Let me say this. I spent 28 years in the private sector having to manage complex operations. And so what this amendment does, it doesn't preclude the Forest Service from generating all the data in the format that the gentleman from Oregon referenced. What this is asking for here is a one-page summary, a dashboard, if you will, so we can see, kind of cut to the bottom line in terms of the numbers that I pointed out here. So often in Washington, we are drowning in data. We're starving for wisdom. This is a simple dashboard that cuts to the bottom line here of looking for the volume of board feet actually harvested, the cost of the preparation of the sales, the revenues generated from the sales, and the amount of receipts distributed to the beneficiary counties. That's the one-page summary. All the other data can be contained in the other reports for the perusal of members and others who want to see it. But this just cuts to the chase to give a simple one-page dashboard of what the bottom line results are as a result of this bill. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Oregon.
I'd yield myself such time as I may consume. Well, you know, the Forest Service isn't always responsive, but I believe if the committee chairman, in fact, I would be happy to join as the ranking member with the committee chairman and the gentleman from Montana and any other members of the committee interested in a letter to the Forest Service saying, hey, you produce all this incredible amount of data. Some people think it's too much. So how about a one-page executive summary that covers these points, which would precede the other 18 pages online? They don't have to print them, so there's no cost to the government. But I don't, you know, I think that might solve this problem. I don't believe we need to pass a law to get an executive summary. I mean, most federal agencies provide federal summaries of all sorts of stuff, executive summaries, for people who don't have time or interest in knowing things in more detail. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Montana.
I just would say that as I've been back here, moving from the private sector to the public sector, sometimes you've got to lay out in specificity the need for a one-page summary of what's going on so that members, anybody else who wants to see, can take the 30,000-foot view here in terms of is this program being successful or not. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon.
I have the right to close, and I'm prepared to close if the gentleman wants to summarize his previous arguments.
Gentleman from Montana.
I'll yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Oregon.
With that, I'd yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Montana. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in Part C of House Report 113-215. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in Part C of House Report Number 113-215, offered by Mr. McClintock of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 351, the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, an estimated 1 billion board feet of fire-killed timber can still be salvaged out of the forests that have been devastated by the Yosemite Rim fire, but it requires immediate action. As time passes, the value of this dead timber declines until after a year or so it becomes unsalvageable. It's been the practice of radical environmental groups to file lawsuits against such projects with the objective of delaying salvage until the timber is worthless. This amendment waives judicial review of the salvage plans for the 2013 fires. This is exactly the same approach taken in legislation offered by Tom Daschle a few years ago to allow salvage of beetle-killed timber in the Black Hills National Forest. Salvaging this timber would throw an economic lifeline to communities already devastated by this fire, as local mills can be brought to full employment for the first time in many years. And it would provide a new stream of revenue for the federal government as this salvageable timber is auctioned.
Would the gentleman yield?
Be happy to yield to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman for his offering this amendment. Last year in my home state of Washington, over 300,000 acres burned, and yet the Forest Service has yet to salvage anything, and I dare say now that whatever value is that salvage timber probably has gone away. I think this amendment addresses that issue very, very well, and I support the gentleman's amendment.
I thank the gentleman and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Rise in opposition to the amendment.
Okay. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Again, this is an area where we do have some grounds for potential agreement, and part of the problem is the Forest Service budget. I mean, not only are they spending half their budget on fighting fires, they've had a brain drain because of cuts in personnel and staffing, and they really don't have the personnel to go out and I suggested a number of years ago, last time we had a salvage rider, that a great alternative would be to have the Forest Service establish a strike team to go out to major fires, in fact, while they're probably still burning, and begin to map out a recovery effort, where it might be appropriate to go in and do some salvage, where there are critical watersheds at risk and there's going to have to be some immediate mitigation with the planting of grass or other efforts to mitigate problems that will come with the rainy season in a few months in California. And, you know, I believe there is a better way to get there, but this is really, you know, there's a new kind of current trend online. It's called Throwback Thursday, and to me this is really Throwback Thursday to one of the most controversial pieces of legislation ever adopted by this body back in the 1990s, which was a massive salvage rider. Now, I have participated in a much more discreet individual process when I was first here as a sophomore member of Congress with Senator Mark Hatfield from Oregon. We sat down with an area that had been burned, and we negotiated and legislated a salvage, which preserved the areas that needed to be preserved. There was a potential for 186 million board feet. We ended up legislating somewhere around 70 million board feet. The industry was disappointed. The environmentalists were appalled. But in the end, we got no additional sedimentation. We didn't get any slope slumping, and we did get 70 million board feet of timber out of there. We didn't build a road into a sensitive roadless area. We did it with helicopter logging, and the Forest Service still made money. So there are ways to do this, but this I don't think is the best way to go forward. You know, the underlying legislation already allows significant waivers of NEPA. Any project less than 10,000 acres is not required to go through an analysis, but this would allow a project to move forward no matter what the size or where it's located. Without review, without judicial review, if the project is to salvage dead, damaged, or downed timber in an area impacted by fires this year. We don't really know yet. I mean, I don't think a lot of the areas of the rim fire have yet been surveyed. Certainly the Forest Service doesn't have the assets to do that, to find out what the impacts were, where the spot burns are, where the through burns are, what the conditions are. What areas would be critical to surviving wildlife, what areas are critical to watersheds, and how we will deal with those areas, how we're going to recover the recreation in that area in the future, you know, what would happen with building of roads and logging and salvage logging in those areas. So I believe that this is, you know, a bridge too far in terms of expediting recovery and or potentially salvage efforts and would oppose the amendment.
Gentleman from Oregon, reserve.
I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to my neighbor to the north, the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, for 1 minute.
The gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you to my colleague, Mr. McClintock, for bringing this measure forward. You know, the crazy thing about this is that each year you have devastating wildfires in California and the West and other areas of our country. We act like we're reinventing the wheel each time when we need to go out and do the basic salvage work. You have a narrow window of time that you can get value out of it before the trees that are there that have value can be salvaged and turned into something useful. You could have participatory people in the industry helping bring that value out. If you lose that window of time, then you have higher costs. Maybe these areas don't get recovered because nobody can make a living out of it. So this is a common sense measure. It's really a no-brainer that ought to be used to move forward for this 2013 season, but also establish a template long-term so that we can have a sensible forest management policy and get in and do these strike teams. Let's get a template that says we don't have to reinvent the wheel each time there's a fire, but instead move quickly, get the industry to do it, and have our forests start their restoration and recovery project as soon as possible with that value. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Oregon.
Reserve.
Reserved. Gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm now delighted to yield 1 minute to my neighbor to the south, Mr. Denham, California, also a co-author of the measure.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Denham is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the McClintock, McCarthy, LaMalfa, and Denham amendment. I'm proud to co-sponsor this amendment to speed up the timber salvage project on the acres burned in this catastrophic Yosemite Rim fire. I'm never surprised by some of the arguments that are made down here. You'll hear that we just don't have enough people to go out there and survey. But yet, by harvesting this very timber that will be rotted or infested in several months, would actually pay not only for the Forest Service to go out there and survive and help to pay for the Forest Service salaries, but actually in a community like ours, helps to pay for our schooling and some of our local costs as well. The timber salvage can go a long way to benefit local economies throughout the state. This timely amendment limits the amount of lawsuits that could be used to slow down and hold up the salvage process. Under the proposed amendment, wood salvage from the Yosemite Rim fire could be quickly sent to mills across California, fueling construction projects and benefiting local economies receiving the timber and providing much-needed local jobs and revenues to the impacted counties. Our communities have suffered an untold damage with the historic and catastrophic wildfire that burned over 400
Gentleman's
acres.
time has expired.
I ask the gentleman to yield another 30 seconds.
15 seconds.
Gentleman yields 15 seconds.
Air quality is worsened. The fertile rangeland near the fire may have been sterilized by the heat. Our water sources will experience degradation from runoff, and our beautiful forest land will remain blackened and sparse for years to come. I ask your assistance in passing this critical amendment to put people back to work and start cleaning up this catastrophic situation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from
Reserve.
California. Reserves. Gentleman from Oregon.
I'm prepared to close, so the
Okay. Gentleman from California.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I can't put it any plainer than this. Without this amendment, 1 billion board feet of timber owned by the people of the United States will be lost forever. We do not have time for endless years of litigation. Within a year, this timber, which can now be salvaged for productive use, it can provide jobs for the people of our region and can provide a stream of revenues for our ailing U.S. Treasury, will be rendered utterly worthless. This is precisely the same approach that was used when Democrat Tom Daschle faced the same problem in his district over beetle-killed timber. We are applying exactly the same policy to salvage this timber. I would hope that the gentleman from Oregon, in the spirit of bipartisanship, will recognize that the same remedy used in a Democratic region ought now to be used for this district in California. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman from California yields back. The gentleman from Oregon.
I thank the gentleman. Actually, this wouldn't apply just to the Rim fire, as I read it, and the gentleman can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it applies to any area that burned in 2013 anywhere in the United States of America, which would certainly include both Democratic and Republican districts. Fires are not very partisan in their destruction. So that is an incredibly broad brush. That would mean there could be no analysis done by Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, or anybody else before salvage efforts might begin on forests all across America. Now, if you're bidding on a salvage sale, it isn't your job to care about whether or not the road you're going to build in or the area you're going to access is subject to the slope slumping when the rains start in a couple of months or the snows come in the intermountain regions or up in the northwest. This is extraordinarily and overly broad. We've already exempted things up to 10,000 acres. I believe there's a better way to approach this. The other gentleman from California talked about getting in there, and then we would have the money for strike teams. I would say that's just a little bit backwards, really. I mean, these are public assets. This fire is a disaster not only for the people of your district, the people of California, but the people of the nation, particularly with the proximity to one of the nation's most loved parks. If we did have a strike team, we could have areas like that surveyed by spring and plans in place by spring to know where it might be appropriate to salvage and where it isn't appropriate to salvage, and there would still be value. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The question on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair is the ayes have it.
It's record vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in Part C of House Report 113-215. For what purpose does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
To offer an amendment, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 4, printed in Part C of House Report Number 113-215, offered by Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Pursuant to House Resolution 351, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair will recognize the gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for considering my amendment today to House Resolution 1526, the Restoring Healthy Forests for Healthy Communities Act. Let me begin first by saying I fully support increasing the timber harvest on federal lands, and I'm excited for the opportunity to create jobs and stimulate the economy in my rural Missouri district. The issue that my amendment deals with, prescribed fires within the Mark Twain National Forest, is a symptom of the larger problem that H.R. 1522 seeks to fix. To put it simply, our national forest system could be better managed. 50 million board feet of timber with an estimated value of $4.75 million dies every year in the Mark Twain National Forest. Only 38 million board feet of timber with an estimated value of $4.37 million is harvested. There are individuals ready, willing, and able to harvest the timber, but they are prevented from acting by the federal government. The Forest Service has made the harvest problem even worse by burning whole swaths of harvestable acreage. While prescribed fire has been used in the past as an effective technique to manage and prevent forest fires, in this instance, the fires are being used to change the landscape of the area from its current forested state to pine oak woodlands. I have personally visited sites where trees that could be harvested for timber are being burned. Folks, it just doesn't make sense to be burning this timber that could be used to bring new jobs and economic prosperity to my district. The forest products industry in my district is alive and well, and we certainly could make use of these trees that are instead being burned. The wood, flooring, the barrel industry, timber and charcoal industries are major employers in my district that will put people back to work turning these trees into valuable finished products. My constituents who have evaluated the impacts of the initial prescribed fires are very concerned about the results. The large size of the burns and the failure to utilize cut hardwoods has created a residual forest condition with scorched trees and bare mineral soil. A number of trees the burns intended to promote were exposed to excessive heat, which has caused these trees to die unnecessarily. The burns have also caused the forest floor to become more susceptible to erosion. As a result of this situation, we need to place a moratorium on these prescribed fires in the Mark Twain National Forest until such time as their effects on the forest can be determined. I wrote a letter to the Forest Service in August along with 5 of my colleagues from Missouri seeking this information and have yet to receive a response. I ask this body to approve my amendment so that we can get more information from the Forest Service about the situation, and that in the meantime, more of our valuable Missouri hardwoods will not be indiscriminately burned.
Gentleman yield.
I yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him for offering this amendment. I think his amendment takes care of a unique problem, although it may be applicable in other parts. But I think the amendment has the gentleman has the right approach, and I support his amendment. Yield back.
I reserve my time, Mr.
Gentleman from
Chairman.
Missouri reserves. Is anyone, gentleman from Oregon, for what purpose do you rise?
Rise in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
I certainly don't know what's best for the Mark Twain Forest, and I doubt that you had 5 members sign your letter, so that would leave 430 who probably don't think they have any clue either about what would be appropriate in your forest. I would suggest, I mean, we do have a committee of jurisdiction, and there are times when the Forest Service bureaucracy is doing things that I do not approve of. And it would be really appropriate. I don't believe that the committee has done any oversight on this issue. I don't know if the issue was brought to the chairman before it was offered as an amendment here on the floor. This amendment wasn't offered in committee, nor was I was there. There was no discussion of this in committee. It's a very, very localized problem. I would, suggest again, as we did earlier, that first off, this bill is not going to become law before, if they're going to burn this winter, which is when they burn in the Northwest. I assume they do the same thing in your district when the risk of fire is down because of other vegetation and when the moisture levels are higher. This isn't going to become law by then. I mean, if you're doing it if it ever became law, if you're doing it to get their attention, that perhaps you'll get their attention if they're listening. But I would suggest that the gentleman, initiate a process through the committee, ask for, a meeting with the Forest Service under the auspices of the chair, and attempt to get answers to the questions he has. Doing it through this particular amendment is really not going to accomplish those goals in time, if indeed there are immediate plans to go forward this winter. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oregon reserves. What? Gentleman from Missouri?
I just yield back my time, Mr.
The
Speaker.
gentleman from Missouri yields back. Gentleman from Oregon?
I'd yield back.
Yield back. Question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Missouri. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 5, printed in Part C of House Report 113-215. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in Part C of House Report number 113-215, offered by Mr. McClintock of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 351, the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment guarantees that the public has the full opportunity to comment before a forest road is closed or destroyed. These roads are vital to tourism, and tourism is vital to the economy of these communities. Yet the U.S. Forest Service has become very aggressive in recent years in shutting down these roads, restricting public access to the public lands, and replacing Gifford Pinchot's inclusionary vision for the Forest Service, which he once described as serving the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run, into an exclusionary vision that can best be described as look but don't touch. The Forest Service has now bypassed Congress and has adopted a rule that effectively allows it to close any road that it deems to be unnecessary or undesirable without environmental review or public consultation or comment. My amendment simply reasserts Congress's authority to protect public access to the public lands and requires that road or trail closures follow the established process of public notification and input. Under this provision, the Forest Service can still decommission trails or roads that it considers obsolete, but only after, quote, adequate and appropriate public involvement. That's it. Before you decommission or destroy an existing road or trail, you have to ask the public. It codifies one of Pinchot's maxims for what he called the behavior of foresters in public office. He said, "It's more trouble to consult the public than to ignore them, but that's what you're hired for." I reserve. I yield to the gentleman from Washington.
I thank the gentleman for offering this amendment, and if I were to categorize this amendment, it would just simply prohibit the Forest Service from removing or eliminating roads without public involvement. And in my district, in the Natchez Ranger District, there was a case where they were in fact using other funds that were used to maintain roads, and they were using them to close roads. But all the time, there was no public involvement. I think your amendment addresses that issue, and I support the gentleman's amendment, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. Anyone seeking? Gentleman from Oregon, what purpose do you rise?
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
Again, there's grounds for some agreement here. I agree with the gentleman from California that this very sensitive issue, access to forest lands, is critically important. People who live in, around, near the forest, or people who choose to travel there to recreate. We recently had a disastrous example in my state, the proposed travel management plan in the Wallowa-Whitman forest, which is in Mr. Walden's district in northeast Oregon. The plan was developed in 2009. Little public input would have closed a substantial amount of the road network, and it became a huge, huge controversy because of the lack of public involvement. Even though I had complaints from my constituents, and we're 250 miles away. Although I do recreate sometimes on that forest, but it's not on the road. I access the areas by forest roads. So, this is, something that was of major concern. Regional forester, who was new, said, yeah, you're right, they really screwed this up. Let's do it over again. They started all over again in a very collaborative public process. But this goes a little bit beyond requiring the public to be notified and involved. In fact, it's a little contradictory because major parts of this bill do away with NEPA, which does require meaningful public involvement and response to comments by the public meaningfully by the agency. So I don't know whether we've removed that requirement from the existing law for the removal of roads, and that's why we have to have this amendment or not. But this goes a little further. It says these would be legally created roads. And as you know, I mean, we got people down in Nevada and elsewhere arguing with the government, or even attempting to take back government property by saying these are legally created and are not the property of the Forest Service. So first you got to decide which roads are legal, which are covered, which are illegal, not covered. Who's going to decide that? The Forest Service, user group who has an informal road that they've established. How will that help with this problem? It also requires the Forest Service to make a specific decision regarding a road or trail closure, including adequate and appropriate public involvement. Okay, well, what are those standards as opposed to, say, the NEPA standards, which should apply in these cases? So I think that this could actually lead to more confusion in litigation. I agree with the gentleman that there is a problem. This is a sensitive area, and in some areas the Forest Service has not dealt well with it, and believe there are other avenues to a solution. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oregon reserved. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, perhaps I could assist the gentleman in his confusion by simply reading the amendment, which is simple, straightforward, and clear. The Forest Service shall not remove or otherwise eliminate or obliterate any legally created road or trail unless there has been a specific decision which included adequate and appropriate public involvement to decommission the specific road or trail in question. The fact that any road or trail is not a forest system road or trail does not appear on a motor vehicle use map shall not constitute a decision. That is it. That is the alpha and omega of this amendment in its entirety. If you're going to close a public road to the public, you need to ask them first. I cannot emphasize enough how important this is to the mountain communities of the Sierra Nevada that depend on mountain tourism for their economies. Tourists don't go where they're not welcome. Tourists don't visit where they can't get to. The public's use of mountain trails and roads is absolutely central to mountain tourism, and removing or closing these trails or roads is not something that should be done behind closed doors by administrative fiat. I'd ask for your aye vote and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California yields back. The gentleman from Oregon.
Well, but that doesn't address the concern about legally created road or trail. And again, I'm not aware that there's a definition elsewhere in the bill nor in this amendment for legally created, and there is tremendous controversy and litigation over the issue of legally created. And then it does go on to say the fact that any road or trail is not a forest system road or trail or does not appear on a motor vehicle use map shall not constitute a decision. That leaves open the issue of informal use roads, potentially in sensitive areas that, would have to go through a process before they could be closed. What if it's a newly developed ORV trail through a sensitive meadow? We had someone running donuts up in a very sensitive meadow in the Three Sisters Wilderness, in an area or on the edge of the Three Sisters Wilderness. I mean, did that become a road or a trail that then would be available to vehicles, and we couldn't close that area? And they did. They put in big rocks and other things to close the area off to motor vehicles. Would that have been precluded under this amendment? I don't know. This opens too many questions to controversy and interpretation, and there are times when we do need to act quickly when abuse is taking place. There are other times when the Forest Service has to act more deliberately. I believe the Forest Service can do a better job. I believe in having the public notified, the public fully involved, and the best way to do that on these roads issues is through NEPA. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oregon yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Ask for record vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 6, printed in Part C of House Report 113-215. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in Part C of House Report number 113-215, offered by Mr. LaMalfa of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 351, the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate working with the chairman of the committee, Doc Hastings, as well on the amendments to his legislation. This amendment seeks to prevent the Department of Justice from seeking excessive, unquantifiable damages from property owners who have fires accidentally escape from their property onto public lands. We've seen U.S. attorneys sue landowners for hundreds of millions of dollars above the damage to national forests and the cost of firefighting based on very speculative claims about the value of habitat, claims which appear to be based not on science, but on fact, but only on the desire to generate revenue for the government. When the Forest Service gains as much revenue from lawsuits as it does from timber receipts from an actual working forest, something is surely wrong with the system. This language would help to end that problem in many western states. However, I plan to continue working on this issue until we develop a 50-state solution to this problem. So it is for these reasons that I respectfully ask unanimous consent to withdraw this amendment at this time.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 7, printed in Part C of House Report 113-215. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 7, printed in Part C of House Report number 113-215, offered by Mr. LaMalfa of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 351, the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Disasters like the massive rim fire that impacts my colleague Mr. McClintock's district in the Yosemite National Park, which many people believe is a national treasure, and I agree, not only threaten residents' homes and other structures, they also destroy valuable public property, forests that provide jobs in rural communities, revenue for local governments, and recreation for Americans. Unfortunately, planning and procedural hurdles often prevent the Forest Service from salvaging usable timber and returning the land to healthy condition. This amendment enables the Forest Service to rapidly undertake salvage, rehabilitation, and replanting by allowing those activities to be included in fire suppression, operational, and funding plans. When wildfires impact private timberland, owners know that salvage and restoration work must be conducted immediately. The window before decaying insects eliminates timber's value, which can be only weeks. Site rehabilitation must be done before the rainy season to prevent landslides and sediment from clogging waterways. However, the Forest Service ability to conduct these operations on public lands is so restricted that timber which could generate jobs and revenue literally rots on the ground, even as adjacent private timberland is rapidly rehabilitated. After the 46,000-acre Bagley fire in my district last year, private landowners sprang into action, and it is my understanding that salvage and rehab operations are already complete on nearly all these private lands. These areas have been replanted, rehabilitated, and soon will once again be healthy, productive forests. The Forest Service lands, however, lie nearly untouched as the value of the burned timber disappears. In Trinity County, Northern California, 13 lightning-sparked fires burned over 250,000 acres during the memorable 2008 fire season and caused $150 million in suppression costs. However, the Forest Service conducted salvage and rehabilitation on just a few hundred acres, leaving an area one-third the size of Rhode Island blackened and scarred. This amendment speeds the salvage and rehabilitation process by allowing the Forest Service to plan this work in conjunction with suppression plans, and removes procedural hurdles by defining these activities as part of suppression efforts. The amendment allows but does not mandate the use of suppression funds for these efforts. Again, it does not mandate but allows the use of suppression funds for these efforts. The CBO has stated this amendment has no impact on overall federal spending. Finally, this language will offset firefighting costs by generating revenue for local communities and the federal government through salvage operations. Federal agencies spent over $1.9 billion on firefighting in 2012, and every dollar derived from salvaged timber is one less dollar diverted from other programs. As you may know, I have co-sponsored an amendment with Representative McClintock streamlining judicial delays that slow salvage operations. This amendment complements that language by accelerating the salvage and rehabilitation planning process, but functions independently. I respectfully request your support for this amendment. Yes, sir.
I thank the gentleman for offering this amendment. The issue of salvage is a very important part of proper management of our forests, and I think your amendment adds to that, and I support your amendment, and I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully request your support, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
This raises, the gentleman has made the point that it's not mandatory, but the problem would be we already have inadequate funds for firefighting. As the gentleman I'm certain well knows, that the Forest Service has devastated the remaining funds for fuel reduction, probably restoration activities, a whole bunch of recreation activities and other things. They've all been ripped from this year's budget because they had to spend $1 billion fighting fires, and I believe Congress appropriated less than half that amount. This is an annual problem, and it's time to get real around here about the problem. One is to adequately invest in fuel reduction and not underinvest in firefighting. Until we do a lot more fuel reduction across the West, we're going to have big fires. If we have big fires, we need to fight them, but we don't need to make the big fires more prevalent, more common by cutting the fuel reduction budgets. And we had this discussion a bit in committee, and I actually found that there was some common ground in this discussion. I don't believe that, certainly site rehabilitation and other activities, those are very desirable. But again, to categorize them under firefighting, I think could create major problems. With that, I'd reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California.
Well, and speaking of inadequate funds, if we were actually generating the funds by having actual timber harvest receipts, we wouldn't be looking to the government for the money for the type of fuel reductions that are needed. We would actually be making a living at it by taking adequate marketable timber as well as operations that go along under a timber harvest plan that requires cleanup and replanting. So we would be generating the receipts at the same time we'd be doing this if we had this type of thinking involved with more of our forest management. Not only in the current year where you're gaining those receipts, but in the future as you have a regenerated forest. I would harken back to Weaverville in Trinity County in my area, where there was a fire some years ago that nearly burned the town, But then, with no management, with no restoration, the land laid idle with brush, with snags, with all sorts of things growing back and remaining behind from that fire. It burned again just 7, 8, 9 years later and almost devastated the town once again. Whereas where you see it on private lands, they're out there, they're salvaging, they're getting the job going again and restoring the forest, which is better for the habitat, better for siltation, better for the wildlife, better for the economy, better for everybody. So let's move in the direction of fuel reductions, as my colleague from Oregon was talking about. Let's do the fuel reductions, but we don't have to do it with tax dollars. We can do it with the private sector having marketable timber being taken off and get the job done. So I, again, think this amendment will really help in this regard. So I respectfully, again, seek your support for this amendment. And thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oregon.
Yield myself balanced time. Well, fuel reduction and salvage are two infinitely different categories. Salvage needs to be carefully planned. We already discussed earlier the Forest Service doesn't have the resources to do that, and yet if we take and add that onto suppression costs, that will take money away from fuel reduction and other programs of the agency. I mean, I know around here we spend a lot of time talking about sequestration, and a lot of people think it doesn't have much real impact or it's just waste coming out of the government. It came out of the fuel suppression budget. Then a bunch of the firefighting money came out of the fuel suppression budget, and now we're going to act like there was enough money in the fuel suppression budget or the firefighting budget that we could spend it on other activities. Yes, we want to do restoration activities, but at some point we're going to suck it up and make the investments we need to make in our resource agencies so they can get the job done right. We had a discussion of how to properly approach salvage earlier tonight. I'm not going to reiterate that issue, but this amendment is not mandatory, but as an addition to an already inadequate account, which is stealing from other accounts, would not be good policy. With that, I give back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman?
For what purpose, the gentleman from Washington?
I move the committee to now rise.
Okay. The motion is on. The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 1526, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House in the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 1526 and has come to no resolution thereon. Who gets this? Ready? Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright, is recognized for 55 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise this evening on behalf of the Congressional Progressive Caucus to repeat and enhance the calls made by our colleagues today to end the disastrous spending cuts known as sequestration, to put a stop to the proposed disastrous cuts to SNAP benefits, and to urge the majority to abandon their plans to force the closure of the government and to default on the national debt. I want to start with SNAP. Mr. Speaker, while nearly 50 million Americans struggle to put food on their tables, the majority are doubling their cuts to basic food aid, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as SNAP, which primarily helps feed children, seniors, and the disabled. Mr. Speaker, 92% of the people who are on SNAP are children, the elderly, disabled, or already working. Food stamp recipients currently receive just $1.40 per meal. SNAP is a vital tool to prevent hunger, fight hunger, and help struggling Americans feed their families as they seek new employment, send their children to school, and get themselves back on their feet. Slashing nearly $40 billion from SNAP, the majority bill takes the food out of the mouths of nearly 4 million Americans next year, particularly harming children, seniors, veterans, and Americans living in urban, rural, and suburban communities with chronically high unemployment. 1 in 5 children, that is 16 million children, struggle with hunger, a record high. Now, Mr. Speaker, here to address the effects of the SNAP cuts that we're talking about today is my valued and esteemed colleague from California, Representative Alan Lowenthal. Congressman Lowenthal was elected to represent the 47th District of California after a long and distinguished career both in city politics and in the California State Assembly in Sacramento. Congressman Lowenthal serves on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, as well as with me on the House Committee on Natural Resources. Congressman Lowenthal has stood up as a loud voice against cuts on the SNAP program. He has been quoted in the press as saying, "These cuts literally take the food from the mouths of babes." At this time, Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from California for as much time as he needs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank